And again, I'm going to welcome you all to the first of the fall webinars in the AMATYC series. This is our 9th webinar of the year, which is pretty cool, actually. And we're welcoming Robert Talbert from GVSU. He actually just lives down the street from me, kind of, well, 45 minutes away. He used to live much further away. I like to think he moved to Michigan just to be nearer, but I'm not sure that's true. I'd like to remind you that this webinar is put on by AMATYC, and it speaks to one of the core values to enhance personal growth of instructors. You can find more information on the AMATYC website. The views expressed by the presenter are not necessarily the views of AMATYC, and if commercial products are mentioned, those are not endorsed by AMATYC in any way. The webinar is actually sponsored by the Lift Institute at Muskegon Community College. We are providing the Adobe Connect platform for this. And if you have ideas about future webinars, please feel free to just contact me with those, or wait till the end of the webinar, and then you can mention it in the evaluator part. So I'm going to turn off my mic and let Robert turn on his mic. I'm going to minimize this. Hold on, I think I might have just messed something up. Let's see. Where did my share pod go? And there's Robert's mic. Nope, that's mine. It's been a little while since we've done one of these, huh? I'm going to stop sharing. There, I think Robert should be able to see the screen now to share.
That's right. And first of all, thank you for attending this webinar. How's the audio, everybody? Is that okay? This is where you click the thumbs up or thumbs down, right? Okay, very good. And Maria, am I good to go now? Okay. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Robert Talbert, and we're going to talk today about flipping the college classroom. Heather, we say, or is everyone getting my audio okay? I can adjust lots of different things here. Okay, everybody good to go here? Okay. So thanks for coming wherever you are. My name is Robert Talbert, and we're going to talk about flipping the college classroom today. First of all, a little bit about me. This is me, and I am an associate professor of mathematics at Grand Valley State University. A little higher on the volume. Okay, I'll give it one more shot. We tried this the other day. Is that better? How are we doing now? Okay. Here's some contact information for me. I'll review this at the end. My email address. My blog is Casting Out Nines at Chronicle of Higher Education Blog Network. I'm here on Twitter, also Google Plus, and my YouTube channel, where you're going to see some of the screencasts that I'm be talking about, is right there, Robert Talbert, PhD. Okay, so let's talk about our agenda today. We're going to look at what is the flipped classroom. Especially take a look at how some other college classes have been flipped. It seems like the flipped classroom is a phenomenon, hopefully not a fad, but a phenomenon that's taken off considerably among K through 12 settings, but not quite as much at the college level. So we're going to take a look at how that has been implemented, both my own classes and elsewhere. Especially want to touch on some strategies and best practices, or at least some okay practices for flipping your classroom, and then give some tools for getting started. So what is the flipped classroom, and where does it come from? It boils down for me to how people learn. We design our classrooms and our pedagogy thinking about how people learn. So you can talk about human learning taking place in two distinct phases. One we could call transmission, where learners are receiving information from a source and just putting it into their consciousness. And then the second phase, what Piaget would call assimilation, and that is where we take the information that has been transmitted and received and internalizing that, fitting that into our own internal mental schema, and making sense of it, making it actually assimilate into what we already know. Usually we do transmission in the college classroom and the community college classroom through lectures and through reading, perhaps. And assimilation is where we have students do things that take the information, take it a step farther, homework, lab work, group work, and so forth. The thing about assimilation and transmission, I think we all realize this, is the assimilation part of this is a lot harder than the transmission part of it from a cognitive standpoint. Here's the famous triangle that shows Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive tasks. tasks here. Your transmission phase is usually not going very high up the chain here. In transmission, we usually see attempts to get just basic facts and basic comprehension across. And then in the assimilation phase, that's supposed to take care of the rest of it, the application, all the way up to making value judgments about what you've been learning and mapping the new information onto, or the information you learned onto a new problem. I think in mathematics, it's especially a salient point. We do some examples in class, excuse me, perhaps through a lecture, and then we want students ultimately to map that stuff onto a new problem. Otherwise, we have some concerns as to whether they've really learned the mathematics we say that they're learning. Now, the problem with this, let's see if I can get this to go. Here we go. There's a potentially pretty serious issue with the way that we currently do the traditional model, which is having transmission be the role of what happens in class and assimilation what happens outside of class. And that's a little bit of an oversimplification. I mean, a lot of us do use group work and lab work and so on in the classroom, but generally speaking, we do partition off transmission to take place during class. The problem with this potentially is that the way things are normally situated, obviously the higher up you go in Bloom's taxonomy, the heavier the cognitive load is. The students have to think harder, they have to work longer, they have more demands on what they know. Whereas with transmission, the accessibility of help, we are giving students the greatest accessibility to help at the point where they least need it in some ways. It's kind of like providing a lifeguard when we're still swimming in the kiddie pool. We are there for students at the stage of learning a subject where they really don't necessarily need any help. They're just assimilating things. They're just taking information into their minds and making notes, and perhaps organizing it is about as complicated as things get. And then we turn them loose. We say, okay, now go home and do this. Do these really hard homework problems. For them, it's really hard. Or work on this project outside of class. And although we set up office hours and make ourselves available, it's part of being a good instructor. Still, though, we are giving them complete, right there, live help at the knowledge phase and the comprehension phase, where that help has to be, you have to do a few steps to access that help when they're up in the evaluation and synthesis and analysis stage of things. It seems like that could be a potentially fatal flaw, because how many students need the help but don't ask for it? I think we all know that's the case. So what we might want to do instead is flip this around. Take that accessibility of help and make it directly proportional to cognitive load rather than inversely proportional to cognitive load, so that as students move from lower level cognitive tasks to higher level cognitive tasks, that the help that they get from a domain expert and from an expert learner, that would be us, the instructors, actually becomes greater rather than less. Well, that is the gist of what we call the flipped classroom model. And let's explain what this is. By inverting, I call it the inverted classroom model. It's the flipped classroom model in some cases. They're synonymous. What we're doing in the flipped classroom or inverted classroom is taking the transmission phase and the assimilation phase and reversing their locales in some sense. We're going to now put the transmission phase of learning outside of class and put assimilation inside of class. And the way that this might take place is in transmission, we're no longer thinking of a lecture, it's done in a live setting, but instead, before class starts, outside of class starts, we're having students get that information through podcasts, through videos, through screencasts, or perhaps just through good old-fashioned reading. And that's how students will get the information. The information transfer is shifted to outside of the class, where the help is less available, but it's also less needed. And inside of class, we're shifting from a model of passive reception to active engagement with each other, and having the professor, the teacher, there in the classroom monitoring and being very careful to pay attention to what the students are doing. The flipped classroom I mentioned is catching on rather like wildfire these days, and it seems like when I first started experimenting with this idea 2 or 3 years ago, it didn't seem like very many people were doing it. But now you read about this everywhere, and we have a pretty large number of people in this webinar right now who are interested in doing this. Like I said, the flipped classroom has its roots in just the good old-fashioned case study method that you see very frequently amongst business schools and law schools. And it seems to have first caught on the K through 12 level, but now we're seeing more colleges, two-year colleges and universities flipping classrooms. For example, Miami University has done they were in the process of essentially revamping their entire undergraduate computer science curriculum to the flipped classroom, where it makes a lot of sense. The students don't really learn how to do software engineering by having software engineering lectured to them. They just go out and do it. Economics, the same university, I think they're coordinating their efforts, also moving very much toward the flipped classroom model. UC Irvine has been transforming their undergraduate intro to biology courses to be a flipped classroom model. And Middle Tennessee State University, some of you folks actually teach introductory algebra, so you might be interested in this. Scott McDaniel at Middle Tennessee State has been doing the flipped classroom in his intro algebra courses for some years now with a lot of success, and I have a link to a paper of his at the very end of this. For myself, that's my initials, RT. I'm going to talk about some of these courses in a little bit. I've been experimenting with with a MATLAB programming class, linear algebra. Right now in Calculus 2 that I'm teaching, Calc 3, and I've got this discrete math for computer science majors next semester that I'm sorely tempted to just totally flip, but I feel like I need to ask permission from the computer science department first to do it. I wanted to echo what John has just asked and ask you a question. First of all, what are some questions that you are thinking about? What are some courses that you are thinking about flipping or possibly in the process of flipping? And or do you think might work if you've never really thought about it? I see college algebra. Julie, that's a really good question. How large of a class can you successfully flip? I think folks are still pushing the boundaries on this. The largest class I have worked with is around 30. That's about as large of a class as I get. Liberal arts math, and liberal arts math is a very good place to flip. A lot of good conceptual things that students can read, and we want students to learn how to read. So a lot of college algebra, developmental. I didn't know that about Worcester Polytechnic. That's interesting. Physics. Great, great. Yeah, Larry, I will mention something about calculus here, Calc 2 in particular. Yeah, I would think, I wanted to just touch on something that Rob just said. I would argue that any undergraduate class could be flipped if you do it carefully. Doing it carefully is really important. I want to discuss that later. I should mention that the flipped classroom model is really nothing new, pedagogically speaking. Excuse me. Like I said, it's rooted in just the basic case study method, and engineers have been using this too for quite some time. It's also stolen just from the humanities. I mean, when you take a Shakespeare class, when you took your Shakespeare or literature class in college, did you show up for class and the professor just said, okay, now we're going to read Hamlet Act 1 together here in the classroom? No, usually, I mean, you get that stuff assigned to you outside of class, you do the reading, and you come in and you have some sort of assimilation activity, you discuss it, right? So this kind of pedagogy is as old as the hills, but it seems like in mathematics it's still just beginning to catch on. So very interesting stuff. A lot of you are actually are actively either doing this or thinking about it. I see a lot of developmental math, college algebra stuff. I think there's a lot of carryover that can go from one class to the other. So we're going to talk strategies and case studies here in a minute. So hopefully that'll map onto what your interests are. So one thing from Scott here, maybe this will be addressed later, but during the transmission mode, is the transmission about following procedures or is encouraging ways of thinking? That is a really good question when it comes to making a screencast, and I will touch on that specifically later on. Thank you for asking that question. Do you have any more questions for me before we go on? I'll wait a second or two. Watching that chat window. Okay, well, how's it different from a hybrid class? That's a really good point, Laura. I'm going to bring up the idea of hybrid classes in a few minutes, too, because that's not only a pedagogical issue, it's also an administrative issue. It turns out that hybrid classes are often treated differently from a tuition standpoint than regular classes. So this thing about hybrid classes is really important, so thanks for bringing that up. Don't let me forget about that. So what I want to do now is just talk about a couple of classes, a couple of situations where I have done some flipping, and maybe this will resonate with you in some way or another. One of the things that I like about the flipped classroom model is that you can do it, it's scalable, is what I guess I mean. You can flip, in this case, I'm going to show you how I just took a class that was otherwise quite traditional and flipped just a single topic treatment of it. You can do this as a one-time single throwaway usage if you want to, or you can go all the way to the other extreme and flip an entire semester course, or you could do something in between. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that you flip a course, but you just flip, you know, a certain treatment of a subset of a course. So here's an example of where I just flipped a single topic. That was in linear algebra. So the topic we were working with in my linear algebra class was finding a line of best fit through some data. Obviously, this is a pretty important topic for a lot of reasons, and in linear algebra, the goal here is to actually derive all the math you need to find a line of best fit. And so we were treating this in class, and we were doing this from a from-scratch approach. I'm sorry this PDF is not the greatest. It kind of got pixelated on me. But anyway, in linear algebra, what you do is you try to solve a system of linear equations, and you can't because, like you see in the picture, there's no single set of coefficients that fits all the data, so the system turns out to be inconsistent. And you do some math with this, and this I had given an activity to my class to try to lead them through a discovery activity. And of course, as happens many times, you run totally out of time because students get kind of bogged down. There's a lot of concepts that come together in deriving the least squares formula for a line through a bunch of data points. We ran out of time, and we only had 2 days of class to cover this before the final exam. It was kind of a pretty tight situation time-wise. So I was in a situation where we had not even come close to discussing everything we need to about least squared solutions, and we had 1 day to cover everything else. So what do you do? Well, what I did was I made a couple. There's another way to approach least square solutions. We just call it the normal equations approach. It's just a slightly different algebraic technique. And so instead of lecturing on it, I decided to just flip that one treatment of the topic. So I made these 2 screencasts. These are available at my YouTube channel, which I'm going to type down here in the text box. YouTube.com, Robert Talbert, PhD. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I never ported those over to the new YouTube channel, so I'm going to give you my old one. Those are on that YouTube channel somewhere, along with a bunch of family videos, so those are kind of not the same kind of thing here. So anyway, I made these 2 screencasts, 15 minutes total. This one was, the one on the right was 6 minutes, the one on the left was about 9 minutes. And it just walks students through the process of getting this algebraic approach. And I told them, on the final exam, I'm going to give you an application problem. The final exam was 3 days after this screencasting was done. And I said, I'm going to give you an application problem on the final exam that does require least squares usage. You may either use this new technique that I'm not going to lecture about, that's the normal equations approach on the screencast, or you may use the old technique that we did the group activity on, and I had to follow that group activity up with a lecture. So there were 2 different approaches, one using lecture basically, and one using screencasting. And either approach would work on the application problem I gave on the final exam. And so when I gave the final exam, what was interesting was there were 2 of the students that didn't attempt the problem at all. 5 of the students attempted the problem and used the method that we covered in the lecture, but only 2 of them got that right. Now, the remaining 7 in the class used the techniques that we did not even touch in the class proper. It was all in the screencast, and of those 7 students, 6 of them got the problem right. So this was not a great. It's not statistically, earth-shattering or anything, but at least it's sort of a proof of concept that students can go to a screencast if it's made clearly enough and learn some new technical material and then bring it to bear on a problem. They were able to accept the transmission and kind of put it to work, practice some things on their own, and then do a problem that involves assimilation without having to have a straight lecture given to them. And so that was just one topic, and you can actually take, if you're thinking of flipping a classroom but you're not quite sure if it's really the right thing for you, what you might want to do is take one topic in your course that's coming up and just flip that one and see how it works, and give them a little pre-test, post-test kind of thing, and just to gauge the learning and just ask your students how they like it. If they like it, you could do some more of it. So we talk about the flipped classroom. Just realize it doesn't have to be like an all or nothing sort of proposition. Now, on the other end of the extreme, I wanted to talk about this course that was on the other end of the spectrum. It was an entire semester-long course that was flipped. And this was a course, a computer science course that I used to teach at my former institution on a software package called MATLAB. MATLAB is a scientific computing package that includes a programming language. It also works as sort of like a computer algebra system in some ways. This was a class that was, it's called CMP 150, and it was a 1 credit hour Intro to MATLAB course, and it was taken by freshmen. The intent was it was supposed to be taken concurrently with Calculus 2. It's a prerequisite for Calc 3 and for linear algebra and for a number of other things down the pipeline in the math curriculum as well. These are freshmen taking this course, and of the freshmen who are in the course, considerably more than half of them had absolutely no programming experience whatsoever, and not very many of them are what you would call sort of hard science majors. A lot of them were pure math. A lot of them were education majors. Now, this was the bar graph you see on the right there was actually the second time I ran the class. The first time I ran the class, almost entirely the class were, all the students in the class were math education or elementary education. And so here they are taking this programming class. What are we doing here? So they have not a lot of programming skill in their background, in their skill set, and they don't have a lot of what you might call inherent interest in learning a scientific computing package. So it's quite a different setting from where you see MATLAB usually taught. Usually MATLAB is a subject, a software package that's taught to engineers at large universities in engineering schools. So there's a lot of assumptions that are made about how the course ought to be taught, and in the textbooks you see. And moreover, this is a liberal arts college, and so like a lot of you guys out there who are at two-year colleges or small liberal arts colleges, and we're focusing on sort of different things or additional things at least besides just raw depth of skill. We're trying to get students to be able to learn on their own for their entire lives. I'm trying to teach them how to be intellectually self-feeding in some ways. I want them to become independent, competent problem solvers. Okay, so the flipped classroom is really good for this sort of thing here. Teaching students how to get information on their own and assimilate it without a tremendous need for help is an incredibly important life skill. And so when I started looking at the demographic of the course, I designed the course myself, and when I started looking at the demographic, I just thought it's got to be flipped. There's no other way to teach this besides being flipped. And besides, it was just 1 credit hour. And so that was just kind of a constraint that was placed on by the administration. So you can't lecture. Lecturing is just physically impossible to do in this kind of a setting. So the way that this was constructed, I set up, and I will go into great detail on the idea of guided practice. Each week, so we met 70 minutes once a week for this class. Each week, students were given what I call a guided practice assignment, which includes just a brief overview of what we're going to learn that week, a list of competencies that they need to have coming into the classroom setting, links to some screencasts, most of which I made, and I'm going to go ahead and type in my real YouTube channel down here. Oops, left a W off. I'm a terrible typist, but anyway, there it is. And if you go into my YouTube channel and just look for the MATLAB playlist, you'll see all those, and a list of tasks that they need to perform before they show up for class. So this is like putting a lot of structure on their outside of class experience. I do want to stress that I think it's important for students in this setting is you give them a list of competencies that they need to have down before they come into class, basically, and then you can require as much reading or viewing as you want. Basically, I'm just saying, like, here's what you need to be able to do before you come into class, and you just go find a way to make that happen. And I'm going to give you some links to resources that will help you, but it's going to be up to you, and you can ask me for help. All right. When they come into class, we had a quiz over. I noticed someone was asking about a quiz further up the chat list here. I would give a quiz over the basic competencies using clickers, classroom response systems, and that would generate some discussion oftentimes to see if they had any questions. And then the bulk of the class, 90% of all the class meetings were spent doing lab problems. And I'll show you an example of a lab problem. This is an assimilation task where they're going to take the basic competencies and put it to use on a real problem. And they're also in the class, there were student projects and a final exam. Typically, this is what a week in a single week cycle in CMP 150 would look like. I'm going to retype we had a course blog instead of we were using Moodle, but I don't know, Moodle just wasn't working for the kind of course I wanted to have. So there in the chat window is the link to my course blog. It's still up there. It met on Wednesdays, and so every Wednesday there would be a new guided practice that was assigned for the next Wednesday, 1 week in advance. The Wednesday meetings was also a lab setting, and students had till the Thursday night after the lab setting to hand in their things. There were several tasks, like I mentioned, in the guided practice, and they had to get one task done within 2 days of getting the assignment, and then the rest of the tasks they could just take whatever over the weekend or whatever they wanted to finish things up. So they have a pretty busy, structured week, which is really important because we were only meeting once a week. So you know how students can be. I mean, they don't know how to manage time necessarily, and that's a big issue in the flipped classroom, is teaching students time management. That's another great benefit of the flipped classroom, is that we do end up teaching students time management, but they need help with that, and so the guided practice did in fact help them. So when they show up on Wednesday to this is at the right end of the timeline here, excuse me, the students would show up, take their quiz. If we needed to discuss any clicker questions, we would do so, and then we'd do the lab problem sets. And they had to hand in a rough draft at the end of the class just to show me they were definitely working on things. And that just cycled through 1 week after the next. Very predictable. Here's the next 3 slides are just what a guided practice looks like. There's an this is for the week March 16th, when we're learning about for loops. Here's an overview, just kind of gives students a 40,000 foot look at what we're doing. There are the links to the 4 screencasts, and notice those screencasts add up to considerably less than 40 minutes of quote-unquote lecture time. I think it's really important. One of the big student concerns or complaints, if you will, about the flipped classroom is that it does tend to, that they feel like it takes up a whole lot of time outside of class. It does take up time outside of class. Doing homework outside of class should take up a lot of time, but often, unfortunately, doesn't when it really should. And so, students are definitely, being sort of told what to do here. But keeping the lecturing down to sort of what it would normally be if you were actually showing up and doing this in a classroom setting. If I were lecturing in this class, it would be a 70-minute lecture. So I made 40 minutes of screencasts, or 35, or whatever that adds up to. So roughly half the amount of time that an actual lecture, would take up. Further on down, you see the list of competencies. So these are the things that you need to be able to do when you show up. Do it independently, and don't have to look it up in the documentation too much. So write a flow chart, how do you build a for loop, and so on. And then you can see the exercises down below. One of them was just to fill out a questionnaire. Task 2 was to create a for loop that produces a little plot grid like this. And that was actually part of one of the screencasts. So all they had to do was go to the screencast and tweak a few lines of code that they saw and try to get that for loop to present. I mean, it's totally low-hanging fruit for these tasks here. So there should be no question they should be able to finish that up. And the next couple of slides here, when they show up into class, they have clicker questions. So here is a typical clicker question. What should go in the blank in order to have the for loop do what the English says it should do? And so if you have been really paying attention to the screencasts, you should be able to do this no problem. The answer there is C. I should have made a poll for that just to see if anybody could guess. And here's another clicker question that's a little bit more cognitively complex. So I give them a little code snippet and say, what does this program produce at the end of it? And this is an interesting question. About half the students, if I recall, got this one right, and the other half just didn't really know. They were just guessing. And maybe some of the ones who got it right were also guessing. And so when you terminate the polling with your clicker software, it produces a little histogram of the results. And so I saw, oh man, this is like the question 1 everybody was getting right. Question 4 only half the students got right. So that right there tells me what I need to quote unquote lecture on. The flipped classroom, one of the great benefits of it is that you don't really have to sort of guess what you should lecture on. If you are gathering data in real time about what students know and have picked up from transmission through the screencasts, for example, through these clicker questions, your lectures are basically planned out for you. It turns into a 10-minute Q&A session that is very efficient, totally focused on only the things that students don't know already, having done all this stuff. And I remember this was a good discussion, so I kicked it out to the students and said, what does this program actually do? I mean, you see the code, but I mean, in English, what's happening here? And one guy sort of had a quizzical look on his face. It's like, oh, it just counts the number of prime numbers, less than 10, less than 20, or 10, I guess, here. And it's like, yeah, that's exactly right. And that's what you're supposed to be doing when that goes up a pretty high level of Bloom's taxonomy. Can you evaluate, to stay in English, what a snippet of code does? And then question 5 was always the same on every quiz. That's to give me your questions that we haven't talked about yet. So while students were getting their lab set up, I would just sift through their note cards and kind of group their note cards by question and just make a frequently asked questions list every week. So it ended up, we'd do quizzes, and then we'd have 10 minutes of Q&A time focused only on the things that they want to know about. And then we launched straight into our lab questions. And this is a very typical lab question here. It's very short notice. It's kind of it's sort of got an applied flavor to it. This one is just here's a problem, go and write a program that solves it. Okay, this is an absolutely typical sort of quality control problem that an engineer might see. And it doesn't say use a for loop to do this, or do this little task, this little task, this little task. This is totally an assimilation problem where they really have to take what they learned in the screencast, the basic idea of a for loop, and map it onto a new problem where it's not totally obvious that you're supposed to use a for loop. And in fact, you could write this program without using a for loop. But if you think about how it works, then the for loop sort of becomes the obvious choice for the tool to use. And that's where I want students to be. I want them to look at a problem and know which tool to use. And that's really the same for math as well. Let me type in that link you see down here. I don't think the links are actually active in the PDF here, so bit.ly. And this is just the final exam for the course, which consisted of a bunch of problems that they got to choose from. I think I got the capitalization right on that. Pardon me. They got to choose just a bunch of problems and they solved them. So it's totally focused on problem solving and not so much on me telling them what they should be thinking at any given point in time. Later on down the pipeline, once students were out of this particular course, then following fall, they were in Calculus 3. The first time I ran the course, I just went to the students who graduated from the course in Calc 3 and asked them, what was the most important thing that you learned in the course? And some of the students responded like, so how to solve a problem by writing an algorithm, how to think about a problem logically. I like the comment kind of struck me about, I never used the help section in a program before. And as a computer tech guy, I'm like, you never use the help section. That's the first thing I go to when I'm learning a new piece of software. But of course, that's what I go to because I'm an expert learner, right? I mean, these guys are not expert learners, so they have to be taught things like going to the help menu and looking things up, right? And one student definitely got it. Discovering things on my own is generally a lot more beneficial than having things spelled out. So that's absolutely the case, I think. Google, yeah. I mean, Google is like the universal help menu, isn't it? Who helps Google? That's my question. Facebook? Here's some further polling information I got from these students. It's an interesting mix of responses. I asked them, Math 253 was our Calc 3 class, so how often do you use MATLAB in Calc 3? And basically, they never use it, even though there was a big section on using the 3D visualization techniques that I made some screencasts for. I was not teaching the Calc 3 class, but I made screencasts for the professor of record for that course to show them how to you make 3D graphs and so forth. And they almost never used it, either in class or outside of class, if you look at the top two bar charts. However, you look at the bottom two, there's some reason for optimism, and the self-rated comfort level with using MATLAB, they were pretty much okay with it. Whereas when I asked the same question at the beginning of the CMP 150 class, remember we had a lot of people with no programming experience, a lot of people who were, say, like in the education majors where they're, technologically, they can, even though we talk about digital natives, they're still a little scared of computers in a lot of ways. This was a major shift, like a 2 standard deviation shift up the x-axis here from what we saw at the beginning of the class in the spring semester in CMP 150. And I really like that bottom, that southeast one there. How effectively can you acquire new skills through reading or print? And they self-rate themselves as very strong. They're very comfortable with doing that, and that's precisely where we want sophomore, second-year math majors to be, I think. And that course, by the way, is going to be, if you go to mathworks.com, that's good. That had a big write. It's going to have a big write-up in the MathWorks news and notes that's going to be appearing next month. There's some of my students and me. They had a big photo shoot and everything. It was kind of fun. So there's a lot more details about that coming up. Again, let me type in the URL. This is for www.mathworks.com, and that's the company that develops MATLAB. And if you just go in there and do a search under MathWorks News and Notes, it'll bring you to the most recent link. This is their trade magazine. Okay, so do you have any specific questions about these two particular cases that I presented here? Happy to elaborate on anything that you've seen here. Meanwhile, I'm going to kind of scroll back up through the chat window, see if there's anything I can touch on. Krista's question about support is extremely, extremely important. I would like to know the answer to that at some point. We're going to touch on issues in just a few moments. It says multiple attendees are typing. I'm just kind of bracing for the flood of text. Do students do the homework assignments before the next class session? Yeah, in the guided practice, there are, I don't really call them homework, I just call them tasks. These are things that I want them to do. In the guided practice, there's 3, in that course, and CMP 150, the MATLAB course, there were 3 tasks per week that they had to do. So they had to complete those prior to the next week's meeting, and one of them they had to complete like 5 days before the next week's meeting, so they weren't really allowed to procrastinate on that completely. Do you ever encounter a class which a large percentage of students don't do? No, that never happens to me, Julie. No, oh yeah, seriously. I mean, yeah, getting students to do the work outside of class is the big question about the flipped classroom, isn't it? I mean, it's really the question about any class. So I'm gonna mention in a few minutes just some strategies for getting students to do the work outside of class. There's carrots and sticks that are involved in both of those cases. Yeah, the comment from David Wiley, don't do it unless you already have tenure. If you have tenure, I think you should feel safe. If you don't have tenure, don't be afraid either. Again, this might be a case where you might want to try flipping just like 1 or 2 things in the class, or creating a sequence like we're going to flip 1 thing every 2 weeks and call it a workshop of some sort. You know, you can ease into it, but do be careful. Okay? How do you provide video, whatever, so it encourages making sense, reasoning? That's a great question, Scott. I'm going to elaborate on that considerably in just a few slides. So yeah, the short answer to Scott's question is you want. I think an effective screencast is not just simply information from my lips to your brain. It has to be modeling the problem-solving process and the thinking process that goes into play. We're trying to teach students how to become independent problem solvers, right? Not just consumers of information. So I think of it, my colleague David Coffey here at Grand Valley calls it just the think aloud, and that's what a screencast ought to be. Present a problem and you do it, but you're also thinking through it out loud so students can see what the process actually looks like. Do you provide a transcript for videos that you post? Yep, that's the elephant, all right. And again, maybe I should just continue on because you guys are asking awesome questions that I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. So, yeah, transcripts and ADA compliance. That's becoming a huge issue. And Maria, thanks for throwing that blog post up there. That was an excellent post from a few weeks ago. Well, let me go on to talking about strategies. I mean, this is where your questions are all tending towards. So what are some strategies for the flipped classroom? I can only talk about what's kind of worked for me, I guess, and what's worked for others that I've seen. I do want to say, don't be afraid to try this because the payoff is so great. I mean, we're getting students in a highly effective way, if it works, to be independent and confident lifelong learners, okay? So they can totally do this at the stage where they are at, no matter what. But you have to be very careful about how you manage this course. You can't just flip. I think there's a common misconception that the flipped classroom is they watch the lectures at home and then they do the homework in class. It's way more than that. You have to very carefully manage your course. Now, what seems to make flipped classes successful, there's not really a lot of research on this, but you have, first of all, give high quality resources for students to use. Really good screencasts, good print resources. Anything that you give to students needs to be top notch. Students will not tolerate low quality stuff. That includes if you have bad audio on your screencasts, it's gonna poison the whole classroom. It's little stuff like that. It has to be high instructional value, but also high production value in the same time. Students really need a lot of structure during that out-of-class transmission phase. Otherwise, you know what's going to happen. They're going to not do the homework, or they'll wait to the night before and try to watch 50 minutes of screencasts, and it's just impossible to assimilate it all. Attunement to what students really need. You have to pay a lot of attention to students, both what they say and what they don't say about how they're doing in your course. And finally, the problems you give in the assimilation phase have to actually be interesting and challenging. They have to be fun, they have to connect to what students want to know, and they have to really push them, otherwise they're just going to get ignored. So for me, the workflow that's worked for me is in setting up the inverted classroom or the flipped classroom. I give print and video resources for basic information. The clearly stated learning objectives. That's the competencies list. Here is what you need to know before you come into class. Boom, 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 boom. And so it's totally unambiguous. Students know exactly where they stand, and given some exercises to help them get there scaffolded up. And then the workflow is, students start by doing their basic viewing. They do this guided practice, which has been very effective. And then into the class meeting, you give them some sort of short quiz that reinforces their mastery, keeps them honest. The assimilation problem is important. And they have some further problems, perhaps, that you may or may not elect to give for homework. And then you just keep cycling through it in a very predictable pattern. What's worked for me, at least, for resources goes, I want to focus on the outcomes. I don't want to say, watch this, read that. I want to mainly focus on, you need to do whatever it takes to be able to hit this list of competencies. And students should have some choice, in just how much they want to do. And so in that vein of choice, we want to give students a variety of information, means of getting the information, print and video and podcasts, rather than just like one thing. I have had a lot more success making my own screencasts with students than using something off the rack like Khan Academy. The Khan Academy is kind of a hot button issue these days, but I mean, he does make pretty good videos, I would say. And even if my own screencasts are worse than his, students seem to learn more from them because it's less like I'm just sort of tuning out. One of the big concerns that students have with the flipped classroom is that I'm flipping the classroom just because I'm lazy and I want to have, I don't want to teach so much, quote unquote. If I'm making my own screencast, first of all, I'm thinking through the problems that they're going to have. They are seeing me think through the problems, which is modeling the process, and it adds a personal touch that really can't be discounted. I mean, I think it's really important to try whenever possible to make your own stuff for your class. Plus, it's fun. Screencasting is fun. I keep a really tight leash on the length of screencasts, always keeping in mind that 1 hour inside a class converts to at least 2 hours outside of class, possibly 3 hours outside of class if it's a tough course. And so if I would normally lecture 50 minutes in a classroom, I will keep my screencast length less than 25 minutes. Okay, take the lecture time, divide by 2, and that's a pretty good guide for what students are capable of. We don't want to overload students with all this viewing. We just want to, and so what you make in terms of screencasts has to be very efficient, totally focused on only the most important things, because you can't just make hours and hours of screencasts every week, especially if students like in a two-year college setting are commuter students or they have kids or jobs. They just don't have that much time, so you got to be really good at only the most essential information goes in a screencast. And then finally, I would just avoid any sort of closed proprietary solutions for disseminating this stuff. We're a Blackboard campus, and I live with it because we live with it. But I put up a screencast for my Calc 2 students, and half of them couldn't see it because they didn't have the right QuickTime plugin. It's like, come on, So I just use YouTube and things that are not tied to a proprietary solution. It's just a lot easier that way. The university has no opinion on what I do as far as hosting video and so forth. So I just pick something that's accessible. My students can pick up their phone and go watch the screencast while they're at work or whatever. What's worked for me as far as structure goes is this idea of guided practice. Leslie, I saw that question. Is there a time restriction on YouTube? Unless you post a whole bunch of stuff like Sal Khan does, the time limit is 10 minutes. And that's excellent because 10 minutes coincides almost precisely with the attention span of the students that we're trying to reach. Okay, so I've posted enough stuff to YouTube at this point that I can put up like an hour and a half long video if I wanted to. They lifted the restriction for me because of my volume. Yeah, but I still try to keep it under 10 minutes. I try to keep it under 5 minutes if possible. So Jing is a good tool for that because that's got uh, a software restriction of 5 minutes or less. Anyway, back to this guided practice. I mean, I think I showed you the example a while ago. This is what a basic guided practice structure is like. That has really worked well for students because they don't have to guess as to what they need to know. They, while they're watching the screencast, they know exactly what they should have their antenna out for, and the exercises, scaffold them up to the right levels. Not total mastery of the subject, but mastery of the basics. How do you get students to do the reading and the viewing? That is a great question. I have not tried mind control or hypnosis yet, but I'm open to that idea. What's worked for me instead, giving quizzes at the class meeting based on the competencies. Okay, either using clickers or using your course management system like Blackboard or Moodle. That's been pretty effective, especially if you keep it really, really basic. Students get the picture that if they just study and do their work, and it's not a lot of work, then they will be okay on the quiz. Quizzes keep students honest. The thing that has been the most effective to me is to simply don't give in to students being unprepared. Students will come in and they'll say, oh, I didn't watch the screencast. Could you go over this? And you just say, no. That was your job. You had a week or whatever to view these screencasts and ask questions. And if you did not, then that is not my problem in some sense. That was your problem. Okay, and students very much get the picture that you're not going to bail them out. I think that students often, and it sounds cruel, I know, but it's for their long-term benefit to say, no, here are the boundaries. Okay, you do the screencast and you can ask questions as much as you want in my office or email up until the class time, but when it comes class time, you got to know what you're doing, at least on this basic level. And if you keep a hard boundary right there, students will follow it. And students are like infants in a lot of ways. That's a little condescending, I hope not, but they're just trying to find the boundaries, And if they sense that you're willing to give, and they show up and nobody knows what they're doing, and you give into it, then they're going to show up the next time not knowing what they're doing. So this is it's kind of hard to say, but. Don't get into unpreparedness. Warning, this will make students mad. And I'm going to show you a couple of comments that I've actually never shown anybody except my colleagues at Franklin. These are some blog comments that cropped up. I don't think these are the same two students because one guy, the bottom comment, I know who this is, even though it wasn't, he faked a username to put it up there because the spelling is horrific. These are two blog comments that I got in the first week of CMP 150 before we'd even had a guided practice problem. So is this really going to be how much work you expect us to do? 3 hours. Basically, the guy in the top here is incredulous that I would think that anybody would spend anywhere close to 3 hours a week outside of a class for a 1 hour class. He's doing excellent math here. Yeah, you would need to work about 5 hours a day. If you're carrying a 12-hour course load, I guess is what he's doing. He hasn't really read the syllabus either because we didn't have any timed tests in here. And, I think he really gets to the point there in the last line. I really hope that you reevaluate your expectations because they are too high. Well, I think they're high enough. Excuse me. But this is kind of a reaction. This came in, like I said, after the very first week of the class where we hadn't even done any flipping at this point. And another comment about things taking time outside of class. I have more work in my 3, 4, 5 hour classes. I think I probably if they're working less than 3 hours outside of class for a 3 hour class, then I think that says something about the other class perhaps. But not to defend myself here, but this is the kind of stuff. If you do a flipped classroom, you will get pushback from the students. You will. Okay. Even the ones who have been through this before will give you pushback. So that brings us to the question of, what has worked regarding attunement, meaning they're just paying attention and knowing, yeah, exactly, Steve, that's what I said too, and besides, well, I won't dwell on this because every time I look at those blog comments, I get a little hotter on the collar. What's worked for me as far as trying to get students on board with this? Remembering that students are in a stage of development. I mean, a lot of these students, if they're freshmen or first or second year students or first time in any college kind of students, they are still in that dualistic phase where everything's got one right answer and everything fits into a neat category, and the professor is going to tell them what to do, and the test is doing more of that, basically. And this is not how it works in the flipped classroom or in life in general. So just keeping in mind that they're going to need a little bit of help getting up to this level. You can't just walk in and say, hey, I'm not lecturing, I'm going to flip this whole thing and you're going to like it. they're going to need some help with that. They're going to be eased into it. Yeah, I'm going to kind of kick it into high gear here. Students need to unlearn the lecture culture here, and it's clear about boundaries for help. My first time I ran a flipped classroom, students somehow got the impression they were not allowed to ask for help ever on anything, and so they were totally stressed out. And so I had to come in and say, no, look, you can ask for help. I'm just not going to do all the work for you. That's the only thing. My colleague David Coffey again talks about the gradual release of responsibility. Excuse me, and that's been the model I've adopted. Start by doing more than you would normally do in a flipped classroom for the students, and just gradually let them take over. Okay. And another thing is you have to engage in a 24/7 marketing campaign about why the flipped classroom is good, aimed at your students. Every time you get a chance, you have to describe why what we're doing is going to help them later on. You have to saturate them constantly. It still doesn't work. I was still getting comments at the end of the course about, this takes too much time, I can't play football, that kind of thing. Some potential issues here too, culture shock. There is an issue about access to technology too that a lot of us have to deal with on kind of on an individual basis. I've mentioned some tools that are online here. If your students have issues getting online, you can always give screencasts to them on a disk or on a flash drive, or if they have an iPod Touch or an iPhone, just charge it onto there. For us, there is a time investment involved with this. There is a sort of a culture shift of our own that we have to get used to about not being the sage on the stage anymore, about being the guide on the side and the coach. I reckon that I probably spent about 6 hours a week prepping that 1 credit hour MATLAB course. Now, if I were going to teach that again, I would be spending considerably less because I wouldn't have to be making the screencasts all over again. There's a significant startup expense as far as time goes in getting the screencasting done. But once you do it, it's there forever. So there's something to that. Administration, I really wish we had more time to talk about accessibility, ADA things. I will just say that that's more of a screencasting issue than anything else. And what I found works for me in screencasting is I make a script for all my screencasts and I just read from the script. I didn't do that with a MATLAB course, but I do that now for my Calc 2 course. And that, if it were required of me to caption my videos, I could just conceivably go back in and do a massive cut and paste job. I wouldn't have to do a lot of typing or transcribing, I guess. So far, that's not been required of us here at Grand Valley, although we're a public institution in Michigan. But I think it's coming, and I think if you go back and read Maria's blog post about that, it's starting to catch on. North Carolina, California, you can't put something on the web unless it's totally ADA compliant, including people with hearing issues. There is an issue in some cases about whether the flipped classroom constitutes a hybrid course, and if that changes the way the tuition is charged, perhaps. You would just need to be really, really clear on this with your institution about what the rules are. I'm going to skip this slide just for a second, maybe come back to it after I just blow through some tools here real quickly. You've raised some issues. Think about this question. If we have time, we'll come back to it. What other potential issues do you see with the flipped classroom in your setting, and what solutions can you imagine? If you want to, you can go ahead and chat about that as we go. Some tools that I found helpful for making screencasts. Jing is an excellent tool. It's free from TechSmith. Camtasia is my go-to tool. It's not free. It's about $100, but it's fantastic. It does everything. Also from TechSmith, a fine Michigan company. I use a Wacom tablet. I'll hold mine up to you right here. It's an old-fashioned graphite tablet that I do for sort of writing on the board kinds of screencasts. And I use Keynote for my software if I'm doing that's the Mac version of PowerPoint if you want to do any sort of lecture capture type of thing. If you want to use pre-existing video resources, Khan Academy is good. YouTube is excellent. And iTunes U is also okay, although it's got a little limitations. You can't just go to the web and get on iTunes U. I mean, you have to be using Apple software and so forth. We know Maria can speak to her the potential issues of using iTunes. For video hosting, I prefer YouTube greatly because it's free, it's accessible, people can get to it on mobile devices, which is very important. iTunes U is okay. Your institution has to have an iTunes U account, I guess, set up, and so not everybody can do that. Screencast.com, somebody mentioned in the chat screen, is really excellent as well for hosting videos, although there is a bandwidth limit, so you might have to end up paying for a monthly subscription, $10 a month I think it is. For quizzes, give me the quizzes. I've been using Turning Point clickers for some time now. They're really great. The quizzes are short and inexpensive and time-wise. They do give individual accountability, and they give you that instant feedback. So students know what they made on the quiz the moment the quiz is over, so that's really nice for them. And clickers are relatively inexpensive, about $30 a device, and many schools already have them. You just have to ask for them. Any other questions about these tools? Anything else you want to mention? I see Hippocampus going over. I've never quite seen that. Screenomatic, yeah. Another one is, I'll type it over here, is Screener. That's a Screener is a Twitter-based screencasting software. It's got really great video quality, but it's like it's capped at like 2 minutes or 4 minutes or something like that. But it's really good. Something else to think about. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to kind of go through a few more things here at the end here. I would just say for more information, here are some, I believe you can get these slides later, but here are some articles that are some research articles about the inverted classroom. Scott McDaniel's article on algebra is, back in March it was forthcoming. I haven't seen it appear yet, so I don't know where it is. But these, the top one is about the Miami University software engineering course. The second one is from the Miami University econ course. You just Google inverted classroom. You can or go to Google Scholar and do inverted classroom and get a lot more there too. This TED Talk is fantastic. Sal Khan again is a great place to think about. He talks about the flipped classroom explicitly in here. Some people have different opinions about his particular videos, but generally that's a great video to start if you want to get inspired to do some interesting things. Do you have any other quick questions that you have? I know we're almost out of time, but any other questions, just shoot them out here. I'll try to hit them quickly as we go. Well, let me just put this last slide. Thank you, first of all, for taking an hour out of your afternoons, or for whoever was from University of Alaska Fairbanks. Is it afternoon actually in Fairbanks, or is it still morning? I think it's like lunchtime there. But thank you for doing this. The flipped classroom is a great idea. I think it's an idea whose time has come, and if you want to try it out, you can. Depending on your situation, try it in little bites first and then plan for in the future you take in, or you can just dive right in. There's a lot of great resources out there. All these people you see in the chat room are your compatriots in this project here. Here's my information one more time. Feel free to follow me on Twitter or Google+, and I thank you again, and good luck with all this. If you have questions, please feel free to ask me, and have a fantastic afternoon.
Many of you saw that I put the link to the webinar evaluation in the chat window, and it's a Zoomerang survey. It just takes maybe 2 minutes to complete. And if you do need a receipt that you participated in today's webinar, we ask for your information at the end of that, so there's incentive to participate. And if you have suggestions for future webinars, speakers we should bring in, whatever, you get a chance to tell us in that evaluation. The slides will go up on the AMATYC webinar site as soon as we put up the video, and you can find that. Make sure I've got the right web address before I tell you. You can find that, I think, right here. That's correct. So it's just a bit.ly link. Oops, it needs an HTTP in front of it, I think. It's easy to remember. Just how I remember it. It's AMATYC webinars after bit.ly. So all of our past webinars are archived there, and as soon as the webinar is produced, it will be archived there as well. It usually takes us maybe a week to get our act together and get it all produced. If the survey is not working, try copying it and pasting it into a new window. It could just be that your browser's blocking access to that survey. Is anyone else having trouble with that? I'm just going to try it again to make sure it's still working for me. Oh, hold on, I lost a letter on it somewhere. Let's see. http://bit.ly/AMATYC web 09, I think will take you right there. Try that one, make sure that one works. Yeah, sorry, I lost like an AZ off the end of that last link. So try that again and see if that bit.ly link will send you to the right place. I'd also just remind you that you can subscribe to see announcements about AMATYC webinars. by just liking the Facebook page. And so you can like the Facebook page right here. You don't have to be an AMATYC member to do that. And you would see future announcements about webinars there. We have another webinar coming up next week, which I'll just give a quick plug to, which is actually a research webinar about some ways you could do research about what students are actually learning in classes. Sometimes the topics may seem kind of high level, but it's the research part that's actually the interesting part of these webinars. So don't let the topics scare you away. I know it says like it's about teaching series, but it doesn't matter whether you teach series or not. You'll still appreciate the techniques of how they're gathering intel about what students are actually learning. And I believe that the registration for that is now open to the general public. So you can join that one even if you're not an AMATYC member at this point.